This lecture aims to provide some guidance on how students might approach an analysis of an educational issue using the idea of perspectives. For example, some students may select macro issues that are associated with national or international systems, undertaking an analysis of a country system or the relationship of one group within the system, such as Indigenous peoples. At a meso level, some students might choose topics that are related to specific issues within a system. For example, these might be the emergence of ideas such as lifelong learning, the use of specific technologies, the idea of streaming, and high-stakes testing. Other students might select issues that are much more personal and have an influence at an individual level. Examples of these include the experiences of international students and the experience of bullying, and more recently, cyberbullying. This presentation is more concerned with conceptual than applied analysis. This means that you should aim to make explicit the assumptions that underpin the definitions of the terms that are central to your issue, the assumptions that underpin the commentaries that you draw on, and the assumptions that underpin your analytical approach. Whilst an analysis of the assumptions and processes that underpin any particular educational system would seem to be self-evident in the case of an analysis of national systems and macro issues, an analysis of the assumptions that underpin a system are also central to an analysis of all other issues. As Apple asserts, education is not a neutral activity, but one that is produced out of the cultural, political and economic conflicts, tensions and compromises that organise and disorganise a people. One way to analyse the assumptions that underpin a particular educational system is to apply a range of lenses or frames from which to observe the characteristics of that system. This is much like a situation with four people positioned on the four corners of an intersection when a car crash occurs. Whilst all four people observe the same incident, they will see different aspects of the same event. Some parts of the crash will be visible and some invisible to each observer. It is only through a detailed analysis of the reports from each observer that the whole picture can be reconstructed. In social analysis, we can replace the people standing on the street corner with a range of perspectives. These include historical, social, cultural, political, economic, technological, and so on and so forth. There is certainly overlap between these, and they are not mutually exclusive. In any analysis, you should choose the perspectives that most suit your needs. The historical perspectives gives us a sense of how the current circumstances arose. Of course, there will be different portrayals of this history depending on the assumptions and the position that the author adopts. The social perspective gives us a view of how social groups are constructed and how they interact. The cultural perspective, which is often combined with the social perspective as the socio-cultural perspective, gives us a view of the cultural assumptions that underpin the context or environment. This is often a source of tension, contradiction and/or conflict. For example, in Australia, the cultural assumptions of the dominant European perspective are often far removed from those of Indigenous peoples. The political perspective is concerned with power relations, who or what groups are in positions where they are more dominant and make decisions for others. In established educational systems, the assumptions that underpin the system are often invisible as they've become normalised and silent when they become institutionalised. The system is considered to be neutral. The perspectives approach provides a means to start unpacking those assumptions. Using a perspectives approach, it's possible to start addressing questions such as who gets access to what sorts of knowledge, what counts as legitimate knowledge, who determines what counts as legitimate knowledge, for what purposes, and who benefits. In some cases, the answers to some of these questions are relatively explicit. For example, in the case of high-stakes testing, what counts as legitimate knowledge is easily recognisable in the nature of the questions that are asked in the high-stakes test. Who determines what counts as legitimate knowledge is easily represented by those who set and evaluate the results of the high-stake tests. In other cases, the answers to these questions may be less obvious. For example, in the case of lifelong learning as a policy, there is a high level of inexactness about the definition of the term. This leaves the term open to be used by different groups for different purposes. In this sort of case, it is critical that in your analysis you focus on the definitions of terms, unpacking the assumptions that underpin the definition or fuzziness of that definition. In some cases, the sort of perspectives approach that I've proposed can be complemented with the use of other analytical frameworks. For example, in the case of looking at the experience of international students, it might be useful to use the ideas of Hofstede, who identifies 5 dimensions of culture. These are low-high power distance, individualism, collectivism, masculinity, femininity, low-high uncertainty avoidance, and long or short-term orientation. This sort of analytic framework may well be useful in examining the sort of cultural clash that occurs when internationals study in a second country. The example of bullying demonstrates the importance of conducting an analysis from the perspectives of all stakeholders in the activity. The example of bullying demonstrates the importance of examining the institutional context within which the activity occurs, but also from the point of view of the range of actors who are either actively or passively involved in that activity. Events such as bullying do not occur in neutral situations. They occur within a context which is politically, socially, and culturally constructive, in this case, education. A full understanding of bullying also requires an understanding of the institutional context. A second point to make here is that many students wishing to examine bullying concern themselves with who they portray as the victim. However, there are more actors in this activity than simply the victim. These include the bully, the victim, and the bystanders. These are in addition to the institutional context. All of these parties should be considered in the analytic approach. Importantly, we should remember that whilst the experience of victims is important, the ideas of bully and victim are socially constructed. Whilst bystanders may seem to be neutral, they are complicit in the activity as they make decisions to become involved or not to become involved. What might be regarded as a bully in one environment might be considered as a good leader in another. To conclude, I've tried to provide some guidance on how you might go about analysing an educational issue. Firstly, I'd encourage you to define the terms that you use and the assumptions that underpin those terms. Secondly, I'd encourage you to explore the purposes of the educational setting that you are investigating. Thirdly, I'd encourage you to use some analytical frameworks that render the system-based assumptions more explicit, and I've suggested a number. These include the ideas of historical, political, social, cultural, technological perspectives, as well as Hofstede's 5 dimensions of culture.